Some doors are locked to keep danger out, but sometimes they are locked to keep destiny in. Rain hammered against the towering windows of Blackthorn Palace, turning the marble courtyards into shimmering mirrors beneath a slate-gray sky. Emily Carter lowered her head as she hurried across the polished hallway, clutching a silver serving tray with trembling hands. At 21, she had spent nearly 3 years working as one of the countless maids who quietly disappeared into the background of the royal palace, polishing floors that reflected faces she was never allowed to meet, and carrying meals to nobles who rarely remembered she existed. That was how survival worked inside the kingdom ruled by the Alpha King. Stay invisible. Stay silent. Never attract attention, especially his. Emily had followed those rules every single day until this morning. Watch where you're going, snapped the head housekeeper as she brushed past, barely slowing her stride. Emily quickly stepped aside, lowering her eyes in apology. I'm sorry, ma'am. Before she could recover her balance, another servant carrying fresh linens rounded the corner far too quickly. Their shoulders collided. The heavy silver tray slipped from Emily's hands. Crystal glasses shattered across the marble floor with sharp, musical chimes that echoed through the corridor. Every nearby servant froze. The housekeeper slowly turned around, her expression hardening. Do you have any idea what you've done? Emily immediately dropped to her knees, gathering broken pieces with shaking fingers. I'll replace everything. I'll work extra shifts. Please, replace royal crystal? The woman interrupted coldly. You couldn't earn enough in 10 years. A few servants exchanged uncomfortable glances, but nobody spoke. They all understood palace rules. Mistakes had consequences. Leave, the housekeeper ordered. Before I report this directly. Emily's heartbeat pounded against her ribs. She gathered herself and hurried away, fighting back the sting behind her eyes. She wasn't afraid of hard work. She wasn't even afraid of punishment. She was terrified of losing the only place that had given her shelter since her parents passed away. The palace might not love her, but it had fed her. That mattered. Behind her, thunder rolled across the mountains. Wind burst through an open archway, carrying sheets of cold rain into the corridor. Emily pulled her simple gray dress tighter and hurried through unfamiliar hallways, hoping to reach the servants' quarters before anyone else recognized her. She turned one corner, then another. Her breathing grew quicker. Something felt wrong. The corridors became wider, the carpets thicker, the paintings more elaborate. She had wandered somewhere servants were never assigned. No, she whispered, stopping beneath towering black columns decorated with silver wolves carved into the stone. She recognized them instantly. The royal wing. Panic flooded her chest. She spun around to retrace her steps, just as another clap of thunder shook the palace. Startled, she slipped on rainwater that had blown across the polished floor from an open balcony. Her shoes lost their grip. The world tilted beneath her. She reached for anything she could catch. Her fingertips brushed against an enormous bronze door. Instead of stopping her fall, the handle turned. The door swung inward with surprising ease. Emily stumbled forward, unable to regain her balance. She crossed the threshold before crashing onto an impossibly soft rug. The heavy door slowly closed behind her with a deep echo that seemed to swallow every sound outside. For several endless seconds, she simply knelt there, too stunned to breathe. Warm firelight danced across dark wooden walls lined with towering bookshelves and ancient maps. The scent of cedar, pine, and fresh rain lingered in the quiet room. Everything around her radiated restrained power rather than luxury. This wasn't merely another chamber. Every instinct told her exactly where she had fallen. The private bedroom of the Alpha King. Emily's pulse stopped. Somewhere beyond the adjoining doorway, she heard calm footsteps approaching. Slow, steady, unhurried. The kind of footsteps belonging to someone who had never needed to fear anyone. She lifted her eyes toward the sound just as a tall shadow appeared beyond the doorway, and in that impossible instant, Emily realized one accidental step had changed the course of her entire life. Emily Carter forgot how to breathe. The figure standing in the doorway was taller than any man she had ever seen, his broad shoulders outlined by the glow of the fireplace, while the storm outside painted shifting shadows across the room. His dark hair was still damp from the rain, falling neatly around a face that carried quiet authority instead of anger. Silver eyes settled on her with calm intensity, and although they revealed almost nothing, Emily felt as though every secret she had ever hidden had suddenly become visible. She immediately lowered her gaze and scrambled backward across the thick rug before dropping to her knees. "Your Majesty, I am so sorry. I did not mean to come here. I lost my footing. Please forgive me." Her words tumbled together so quickly that she barely recognized her own voice. Silence answered her. The quiet stretched long enough for her heart to pound painfully inside her chest. She dared not look up again. Everyone in the kingdom knew the stories. The Alpha King valued discipline above everything else. His private chambers were forbidden to every servant unless personally summoned. No maid had ever spoken casually of entering this room, because no maid had ever entered it. Emily squeezed her hands together, waiting for guards to drag her away. Instead, she heard slow footsteps crossing the polished floor until they stopped only a few feet from where she knelt. "Look at me," the deep voice said. It was calm, steady, almost gentle, yet impossible to ignore. Emily slowly raised her eyes. Alpha King Adrian Blackwood studied her without the slightest hint of impatience. There was no fury on his face, only quiet curiosity that somehow unsettled her even more. His gaze shifted briefly to the rainwater on the floor near the open door before returning to her frightened expression. "You slipped," he observed. Emily nodded quickly. "Yes, Your Majesty. You were running. I was trying to leave before I disturbed anyone." Another long silence followed. Before Emily could understand what was happening, hurried footsteps echoed outside. The heavy doors burst open as 4 royal guards entered with drawn concern rather than aggression. Behind them stood the palace steward, his face drained of color. Every pair of eyes landed on the kneeling maid. The steward inhaled sharply. "Your Majesty, we deeply apologize. She must have wandered here by mistake. We will remove her immediately." 2 guards stepped forward. Emily lowered her head again, accepting whatever punishment awaited. But before anyone reached her, the Alpha King lifted one hand. Every movement in the room stopped instantly. "No," he said. The single word carried effortless authority. The guards froze where they stood. Even the steward looked confused. "Your Majesty?" Adrian continued watching Emily instead of answering the steward. Something about her presence disturbed the perfect order of the room in a way he could not explain. For years this chamber had felt cold no matter how many fires burned inside its stone walls. Yet since the frightened young maid had crossed the doorway, the restless pressure that constantly lingered behind his thoughts had grown unexpectedly quiet. It was subtle, almost impossible to notice, but unmistakably real. He had spent months with physicians, scholars, priests, and gifted healers who claimed they could ease the invisible burden carried by every Alpha King. None had succeeded. Yet now, standing only a few feet from a terrified palace maid, the relentless tension resting across his shoulders had softened for the first time in years. Adrian did not believe in coincidence. Neither did he ignore instinct. Emily risked another glance toward him before quickly lowering her eyes again. She could not understand why he had not ordered her removal. Every passing second only made the room feel heavier. The steward cleared his throat carefully. "If I may, Your Majesty, the staff will ensure this never happens again." Adrian finally turned toward him. "It will not happen again because she will remain here." The words landed with stunning finality. Several guards exchanged startled looks. The steward blinked twice, certain he had misunderstood. "Remain here?" Adrian answered without hesitation. "Beginning today, Emily Carter will serve within the royal wing." Emily's eyes widened in disbelief. "Your Majesty, I am only a maid. I am not qualified." Adrian met her gaze once more, his expression unreadable. "That is no longer your decision." Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains again, but inside the royal chamber an even greater storm had quietly begun, and not a single person standing there understood why the Alpha King had just changed the course of one ordinary servant's life. Emily Carter barely heard the palace steward dismiss the guards because one sentence echoed through her mind again and again. "That is no longer your decision." The words followed her as she was escorted through the royal wing, not toward the servants' quarters she had always known, but toward a quiet suite reserved for attendants assigned directly to the crown. Every corridor seemed impossibly still. Servants who usually hurried through their duties now paused just long enough to watch her pass before lowering their voices into hurried whispers. News traveled through Blackthorn Palace faster than the storm outside. Before the hour had ended, everyone knew that an ordinary maid had entered the Alpha King's private chamber and had not been dismissed. Emily wished she could disappear into the polished marble beneath her feet. Instead, she followed the steward in silence until they stopped outside a modest room overlooking the eastern gardens. It was small compared to the grand halls around it, but larger than any place she had ever slept. Fresh uniforms had already been folded neatly across the bed. A silver crest of the royal household had been embroidered onto each sleeve. "These belong to you now," the steward said, though confusion lingered in his voice. "You will report only to His Majesty unless instructed otherwise." Emily stared at the clothing without moving. "There must be some mistake. I have served this palace for 27 years, the steward replied quietly. "The Alpha King has never repeated an order." He hesitated before adding, "Neither should you question it in public." When the door closed behind him, Emily sat carefully on the edge of the bed, trying to steady her breathing. None of this felt real. Yesterday, she had been polishing hallway floors alongside dozens of other servants. Today she had become the subject of every conversation inside the palace. She folded her hands together and whispered a simple prayer that tomorrow everything would somehow return to normal. But deep inside, she already knew it would not. Across the palace, preparations continued for the upcoming Moon Council. Noble families arrived one carriage after another, their banners fluttering despite the lingering rain. Advisors crossed meeting halls carrying maps and sealed letters. Royal guards doubled their patrols. Yet even among discussions of treaties and trade, one rumor refused to disappear. Why had the Alpha King chosen a maid? Some claimed she had bewitched him. Others insisted she must secretly belong to an influential bloodline. A few whispered that destiny itself had entered the palace wearing a servant's uniform. Emily knew none of those stories were true. She was simply frightened. Late that afternoon, another servant knocked gently on her door. "His Majesty requests your presence." Emily immediately stood, smoothing the wrinkles from her new uniform with nervous hands. The walk back to the royal wing felt much longer than before. Every step echoed through the quiet corridors until she reached the familiar bronze doors. This time she paused before entering, waiting for permission. "Come in," Adrian's voice called from inside. She stepped carefully into the room, keeping her eyes respectfully lowered. The chamber looked calmer than it had during the storm. The fire burned steadily while soft afternoon light filtered through tall windows overlooking the forest beyond the palace walls. Adrian stood beside a large table covered with reports, though his attention shifted toward her the moment she entered. "Are you settling into your new duties?" he asked. Emily swallowed. "Your Majesty, I have not yet learned what my duties are." For the first time, the faintest trace of a smile touched his expression. It appeared so briefly that Emily wondered if she had imagined it. "Then we will begin with something simple." He gestured toward a nearby bookshelf or several. Leather-bound volumes rested beside a steaming cup of tea. "Keep this room in order. Replace the books after I finish reading them. Refresh the tea when it grows cold." Nothing more. Emily blinked. She had expected impossible demands, not ordinary tasks. "That is all. For today." She nodded gratefully and quietly began arranging the books exactly as instructed. The room settled into peaceful silence broken only by the crackling fire and the turning of pages. As the minutes passed, Emily noticed something unexpected. The Alpha King's usually tense posture had relaxed. His shoulders no longer seemed weighed down by invisible burdens, and his steady breathing matched the quiet rhythm filling the room. Adrian noticed it as well. Without lifting his eyes from the page, he realized the strange calm had returned the moment Emily stepped inside, and for reasons he could not explain, the thought of allowing her to leave before sunset suddenly felt impossible. The following morning arrived wrapped in pale golden sunlight that spilled across the eastern gardens and filled the royal wing with quiet warmth. Emily Carter woke before dawn, just as she always had, although nothing about her life felt familiar anymore. She carefully put on the dark blue uniform embroidered with the royal crest and tied her light brown hair into a simple braid before making her way toward the Alpha King's private chambers. Every servant she passed offered polite greetings, yet their curious eyes lingered a little too long. She understood why. She still could not understand it herself. When she reached the bronze doors, One of the royal guards quietly stepped aside without asking her name. That alone reminded her how much everything had changed. She entered softly and found Adrian Blackwood already awake, standing beside the wide windows overlooking the forest beyond the palace walls. Morning mist drifted between the towering pines while distant birds welcomed the new day. He held a report in one hand, but his attention seemed fixed somewhere beyond the horizon. "Good morning, Your Majesty," Emily said gently. Adrian turned toward her with the same calm expression she had come to recognize. "Good morning, Emily." Hearing her name spoken so naturally by the Alpha King still surprised her. She quickly focused on her duties, collecting yesterday's books, dusting the carved shelves, replacing fresh flowers in a crystal vase, and preparing a new pot of tea exactly as she had been taught. The room remained peaceful, almost unusually so. For the first time in years, Adrian noticed that the persistent pressure behind his temples had not greeted him with the sunrise. Every morning since inheriting the throne, an invisible weight had settled across his thoughts before the day even began. Royal physicians had blamed exhaustion. Priests had spoken of ancient burdens carried by every Alpha King. Herbalists had brewed countless remedies. None had lasted beyond a few hours. Yet this morning the familiar ache remained strangely distant. Emily finished arranging the books before noticing a small stack of official documents resting near the edge of the desk. A sudden breeze flowing through the open window scattered several pages across the polished floor. "I am sorry," she whispered as she hurried to gather them before they became wrinkled. Adrian stepped forward at the same moment, reaching for the last page. Their hands brushed only briefly as they both caught the same sheet of paper. Emily immediately pulled her hand back. "Forgive me." "There is nothing to forgive," Adrian answered quietly. The strange calm that had surrounded him deepened almost instantly. It was not dramatic. There were no flashes of light or impossible miracles. Instead, it felt like standing beside a peaceful lake after years of listening to endless storms. Even his breathing slowed without effort. Emily noticed the subtle change in his expression. "Your Majesty, are you feeling well?" He hesitated before answering honestly. "Better than I have in a very long time." She smiled with quiet relief, believing he was simply enjoying a rare, peaceful morning. "I am glad." As she turned back toward the desk, she noticed a porcelain teacup resting dangerously close to the edge. Before she could reach it, the cup tipped over, sending warm tea across the polished wood. "Oh no." Emily quickly grabbed a linen cloth and gently wiped the surface before the liquid could stain several important maps. Adrian watched her work with patient silence. There was no frustration in his eyes, only careful observation. Her movements carried an unusual gentleness. She never rushed despite her obvious nervousness. Every action seemed guided by quiet kindness rather than fear. When she finished cleaning, she looked up with embarrassment. "I truly am sorry. I seem to make mistakes wherever I go." Adrian slowly shook his head. "You have prevented more problems than you have caused." The words caught her completely off guard. Nobody had spoken to her like that in years. Before she could respond, another knock echoed through the chamber. The palace physician entered carrying a leather satchel filled with neatly arranged glass bottles. He stopped the moment he noticed the Alpha King's relaxed posture. "Your Majesty," the physician said carefully, "you look different today." Adrian folded his hands behind his back. "Different how?" The physician studied him with growing confusion. "The strain around your eyes is gone. Your pulse appears steady. I have not seen you this relaxed since your coronation." His curious gaze shifted toward Emily, who stood quietly beside the bookshelf, unaware that every answer the physician had searched for over countless years might now be standing silently inside the room. By the third day, the atmosphere inside Blackthorn Palace had changed in ways Emily Carter could feel even if nobody dared speak openly in front of her. Conversations stopped whenever she entered a hallway. Servants politely stepped aside, but the smiles they offered never quite reached their eyes. Noble guests arriving for the Moon Council glanced toward the royal wing far more often than necessary, each carrying a different version of the same unbelievable story. Some claimed the Alpha King had finally chosen a future Luna in secret. Others insisted an unknown healer had somehow earned his trust. The wildest rumors declared that destiny itself had entered the palace disguised as an ordinary maid. Emily wished every one of them were wrong. She wanted nothing more than to finish her. duties quietly, and returned to the life she understood. That morning she carried fresh linens through the eastern gallery when two young noble women approached from the opposite direction, their elegant gowns sweeping gently across the polished marble floor. They slowed just enough to watch her pass. "So that is her," one whispered softly, though not softly enough. "She looks ordinary." The other studied Emily with polite disbelief. "That is exactly what makes this difficult to understand." Emily lowered her eyes and continued walking without responding. Years of working as a servant had taught her that silence often prevented greater trouble. Even so, their words lingered in her thoughts long after they disappeared around the corner. Inside the royal wing, Adrian Blackwood had already begun reviewing reports with his council advisors. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours, discussing trade routes, harvest forecasts, and preparations for the gathering of neighboring packs. Throughout the meeting, something unusual happened repeatedly. Whenever Emily quietly entered to replace cooled tea or organize finished documents, Adrian found it easier to concentrate. Decisions that usually required exhausting effort came naturally. His advisors noticed the difference without understanding its cause. "You appear well rested today, Your Majesty," one senior advisor observed with genuine surprise. Adrian simply nodded. "Perhaps the weather has improved." The answer satisfied no one, least of all himself. After the meeting concluded, Emily carefully collected the empty cups while the advisors departed. One folder remained unopened near the edge of the large table. She reached to place it beside the others, just as a small decorative candle, disturbed by the breeze drifting through the open window, leaned dangerously towards several important documents. Without thinking, Emily moved the candle back into its holder before the flame could touch the papers. It was such a simple gesture that she almost forgot about it immediately. Adrian, however, noticed every detail. She never sought recognition. She simply protected whatever had been entrusted to her. "Thank you," he said quietly. Emily looked surprised. Anyone would have done the same. Adrian's expression remained thoughtful. Not everyone notices small things. Before she could answer, another knock sounded at the chamber door. The palace physician returned, this time accompanied by an elderly scholar wearing dark blue ceremonial robes embroidered with silver moons. His white hair rested neatly across his shoulders, and thoughtful gray eyes carried decades of quiet wisdom. "Your Majesty," the physician began, "this is Master Elias Rowan from the Royal Archives." Adrian welcomed the scholar with a respectful nod. "What brings the keeper of forgotten histories to my chambers?" Elias smiled gently before his gaze drifted toward Emily, who immediately stepped back to avoid interrupting the conversation. For several silent seconds, the scholar simply observed her. There was nothing uncomfortable in his expression, only careful curiosity, as though comparing a memory with something standing directly before him. Finally, he turned back toward Adrian. "I have spent 40 years studying the oldest records preserved beneath this palace," Elias said. "Many describe unusual bonds between rulers and individuals whose presence alone brought remarkable peace during times of great burden." Emily listened quietly while pretending to arrange books along the shelves. The conversation seemed important, yet she assumed it had nothing to do with her. "Ancient legends are rarely practical," Adrian replied calmly. Elias nodded in agreement. "Most are not, but every so often, history leaves behind patterns instead of fairy tales." His eyes shifted once more toward Emily before returning to the Alpha King. "If I may, Your Majesty, I believe the palace is about to witness one of those forgotten patterns again." Emily paused with a single book still resting in her hands, unaware that while rumors spread through every corridor above, centuries of forgotten history were beginning to awaken beneath the very foundations of Blackthorn Palace. Emily Carter carefully returned the final book to its shelf, pretending not to notice that both the palace physician and Master Elias Rowan were watching her with unusual interest. She lowered her eyes and quietly excused herself, believing the conversation belonged to people far above her place in the palace. As the bronze doors closed behind her, the room settled into thoughtful silence. Adrian folded his hands behind his back. "You believe this is more than coincidence?" Elias slowly nodded. "I have learned that coincidence rarely repeats itself with such precision." He stepped toward one of the tall windows overlooking the ancient forest. "Every record speaks of an alpha ruler whose burden became lighter in the presence of a single individual. Not because of power, not because of magic, because of harmony. The physician glanced toward the closed door. Her presence changes His Majesty's pulse, breathing, and concentration. I have measured the difference myself. I simply cannot explain it. Elias smiled faintly. Perhaps the old Chronicles already have. Adrian remained silent. He trusted evidence more than legends, yet he could not deny what he had experienced. For the first time since accepting the crown, his thoughts felt clear instead of constantly weighed down by invisible pressure. The change always appeared when Emily entered the room and slowly faded whenever she left for long periods. Facts were becoming difficult to ignore. Later that afternoon, Emily was assigned to organize several unused shelves inside a quiet reading room connected to the royal archives. The chamber had not been opened in years, and fine dust rested gently across rows of forgotten books. Sunlight poured through stained glass windows, filling the room with soft colors that danced across the old wooden floor. Emily worked carefully, treating every fragile volume with respect. As she reached for a small box hidden behind several history books, it slipped from the shelf and landed softly at her feet. The lid opened, revealing an old silver pendant shaped like a crescent moon resting on faded blue velvet. Curious, she lifted it into the light. The metal felt unexpectedly warm in her hand. Before she could wonder why, footsteps approached from behind. "May I see that?" Elias asked gently. Emily immediately offered the pendant. The elderly scholar accepted it with surprising care before studying both the necklace and the young maid standing before him. His calm expression slowly changed into quiet astonishment. "Where did you find this?" "Inside the box behind the books," Emily answered honestly. Elias looked back toward the dusty shelf as though searching through memories older than either of them. This pendant was believed to have disappeared nearly 200 years ago. Emily blinked with confusion. "Then I should return it to the archives." "You may," Elias replied softly. "But first allow me to ask one question." She nodded politely. "Have you ever noticed a small mark on your left wrist that appears only beneath bright moonlight?" Emily instinctively looked down at her sleeve before meeting his eyes again. "Yes," she admitted after a brief hesitation. "I always thought it was an unusual birthmark." Elias remained completely still. The physician's earlier observations, the Alpha King's unexplained calm, and now this forgotten symbol suddenly fit together like pieces of an ancient story waiting centuries to be completed. Looking at Emily with quiet respect rather than curiosity, Elias realized that history had not returned to Blackthorn Palace by accident. It had arrived disguised as the kindest young maid anyone had ever overlooked. By the next morning, the quiet questions whispered through Blackthorn Palace had become open conversations behind every carved doorway. Noble families attending the Moon Council no longer bothered hiding their curiosity. They had all heard the same impossible story. An ordinary maid had entered the Alpha King's private chambers by accident, remained at his side by royal command, and somehow brought him a peace that no physician, scholar, or priest had managed to restore. Emily Carter knew nothing about the growing storm surrounding her. She spent the morning arranging fresh flowers inside the council chamber, making certain every chair stood perfectly aligned before the gathering began. She moved with the same quiet care that had defined every day of her life, never imagining that dozens of important eyes would soon be fixed upon her. The great council hall gradually filled with advisors, elders, ambassadors, and respected pack leaders from across the kingdom. Sunlight poured through towering stained glass windows, covering the polished marble floor with shifting colors. Adrian Blackwood entered last, dressed in a deep black ceremonial coat embroidered with silver thread, his calm presence commanding immediate respect. Emily quietly stepped aside, intending to leave before the meeting officially began. She had almost reached the nearest doorway when one of the senior elders slowly rose from his seat. His expression remained respectful, yet unmistakably firm. "Your Majesty," he began, "before today's council proceeds, there is a matter that deserves clarification." Adrian looked toward him without speaking. The elder continued, "The entire palace has witnessed an unexpected change. A servant without noble lineage now serves exclusively within the royal wing. Such decisions naturally raise questions among the families who have faithfully supported the throne for generations. Several nobles nodded in quiet agreement. Others watched Emily with open curiosity. She immediately lowered her head, wishing she could quietly disappear from the room. Adrian remained composed. Continue. Another elder stood beside the first. No accusation is being made, Your Majesty. We simply ask whether this appointment follows royal custom or whether extraordinary circumstances have influenced your judgment. Emily felt every heartbeat echo inside her chest. She had never intended to become the subject of royal debate. Before Adrian could answer, one noblewoman spoke gently but clearly enough for the chamber to hear. If the young maid has unknowingly become the center of unnecessary attention, perhaps she should return to ordinary service for her own protection. Several voices quietly agreed. To them, removing Emily appeared to be the simplest solution. Emily slowly stepped forward and bowed respectfully. Your Majesty, she said softly, if my presence has caused difficulty, I am willing to return to the servants' quarters. I never wished to create problems for anyone. The hall became perfectly still. Adrian looked at the frightened young woman, standing alone before the most powerful people in the kingdom. She asked for nothing. She defended no position. She sought only peace for everyone except herself. Something inside him settled with complete certainty. He rose from the throne with calm confidence, his voice carrying effortlessly through the silent chamber. Emily Carter has broken no law, violated no oath, and shown nothing except honesty, diligence, and kindness. His silver eyes moved across every face gathered before him. No one will question her place in the royal wing again. The authority in his words left no room for argument. Even the elders exchanged thoughtful glances before lowering their eyes in respect. Emily slowly looked up, unable to understand why the Alpha King continued protecting someone as ordinary as herself. Across the hall, Master Elias Rowan quietly observed the exchange, and as his gaze briefly settled on the hidden sleeve covering Emily's left wrist, he realized the truth was drawing closer with every passing hour, whether the kingdom was prepared for it or not. The council meeting ended, but its silence lingered throughout Blackthorn Palace long after the nobles had departed. Emily Carter quietly returned to her duties, hoping that the Alpha King's firm words had finally settled the growing tension. Instead, they only deepened everyone's curiosity. By evening, Master Elias Rowan requested a private audience with Adrian Blackwood inside the royal archives. Hidden beneath the oldest tower of the palace, the vast chamber held centuries of forgotten journals, faded maps, and carefully preserved records written by generations long gone. Adrian stood beside an ancient stone table while Elias carefully unfolded a weathered parchment marked with delicate silver ink. The elderly scholar rested one hand upon the fragile document before speaking. Your Majesty, this record was written nearly 200 years ago during the reign of King Alaric. Adrian studied the faded symbols. What does it describe? Elias looked directly at him. Not a prophecy, a pattern. He slowly turned the parchment toward the Alpha King. Drawn across its center was the image of a crescent moon, resting beside the crest of the royal wolf. Beneath it, elegant handwriting described a rare bond between an alpha ruler and an individual whose quiet presence restored balance rather than granting strength. The old historians believed such people appeared only when the kingdom required harmony instead of conquest, Elias explained. Adrian remained thoughtful. Every detail reflected what he had experienced since Emily had entered his life by accident. You believe Emily is connected to these records. I believe the evidence is becoming difficult to dismiss. At that same moment, Emily remained unaware of the conversation unfolding beneath the palace. She had finished organizing the royal wing and stepped outside into the eastern gardens as twilight settled over Blackthorn Forest. The air smelled of fresh pine after several days of rain, and tiny lanterns illuminated the stone pathways leading toward a peaceful reflecting pool. It was the first quiet moment she had enjoyed since everything changed. She sat on a nearby bench, looking up as the full moon slowly climbed above the ancient trees. A cool breeze brushed against her sleeves. Without realizing it, she rolled one cuff slightly higher while resting her hands in her lap. Soft moonlight touched the inside of her left wrist. Almost immediately, a faint silver marking appeared beneath her skin. It was delicate, shaped like a slender crescent surrounded by tiny flowing lines that resembled starlight reflected across water. Emily stared at it in complete surprise. The mark had appeared before during childhood, always fading before sunrise, and she had never told anyone except her late mother. "It is beautiful," a gentle voice said behind her. Emily quickly turned to find Elias standing a respectful distance away. She instinctively lowered her sleeve. "I am sorry. I did not know anyone was here." Elias smiled kindly. "You have nothing to apologize for." His eyes carried neither fear nor judgment, only quiet understanding. "Your mother never explained that mark, did she?" Emily slowly shook her head. "She only told me that if it ever appeared beneath a full moon, I should never be ashamed of it." Elias nodded as though hearing words he had expected for many years. "She gave you wise advice." Emily searched his face with growing uncertainty. "Do you know what it means?" The elderly scholar looked toward the bright moon shining above the palace before answering with calm conviction. "I believe your story began long before you were born, Emily Carter, and I believe the kingdom is finally beginning to remember it." As the silver mark continued glowing softly beneath the moonlight, Adrian stepped quietly into the garden from the opposite path. Stopping the moment, he noticed the gentle light surrounding Emily's wrist, and in that silent instant the last remaining doubt inside his heart quietly disappeared. The moon remained high above Blackthorn Palace as silence settled gently over the eastern gardens. Emily Carter slowly lowered her sleeve, but Adrian Blackwood had already seen the silver crescent glowing against her wrist. He walked toward her with calm, measured steps until he stood only a few feet away. Neither of them spoke at first. The evening breeze carried the scent of pine through the garden, while lanterns reflected across the quiet water nearby. Master Elias Rowan respectfully stepped back, allowing the moment to belong to them alone. Adrian looked at Emily with the same steady expression she had first seen inside his private chamber, but now there was unmistakable certainty behind his silver eyes. "You asked me once why I would not allow you to leave," he said quietly. Emily nodded. "I never understood." Adrian smiled gently. "Neither did I. Not at first." He looked toward the glowing mark before continuing. "I believed I was making a decision. Now I realize I was simply recognizing something that had already begun." Emily lowered her eyes. "I am still only a maid." Adrian slowly shook his head. "You were never ordinary. You simply lived in a world that never looked closely enough to see you." Those words settled deep within her heart, because they were the first time anyone had truly seen the kindness she had carried quietly for so many years. The following morning, the Moon Council gathered once more inside the Grand Hall. Every noble family expected another day of negotiations. Instead, Adrian entered with calm confidence while Emily walked several respectful steps behind him, wearing the same simple royal attendant uniform she had always worn. Nothing about her appearance had changed, yet everything about the room felt different. Adrian stopped before the assembled council. "Several days ago, an unexpected accident brought someone into the royal wing," he began. "Since that moment, many assumptions have been made." His gaze moved across the hall before resting briefly on Emily. "Today I will replace assumptions with truth. Emily Carter remains in the royal wing by my command because her honesty, compassion, and quiet courage have earned my complete trust. No title creates true worth. Character does." The chamber remained perfectly silent. Even those who had questioned her lowered their eyes, recognizing the sincerity behind the Alpha King's words. Master Elias then stepped forward carrying the ancient parchment from the royal archives. Without revealing every forgotten mystery, he confirmed that history itself contained rare accounts of individuals whose peaceful presence strengthened kingdoms through wisdom, humility, and harmony rather than force. The council listened with thoughtful respect. No dramatic proclamation followed. No crown was placed upon Emily's head. Instead, something far more meaningful happened. The whispers ended. The judgment disappeared. One by one, members of the council acknowledged her with the same respect they offered every trusted servant of the crown. Later that evening, Emily found herself standing once again before the great bronze doors of the Alpha King's private chamber, the very doorway she had entered by accident only days before. She smiled softly at the memory of slipping across the polished floor in complete panic. Adrian opened the door from inside and met her eyes with quiet warmth. "You may come in," he said. This time, she did not stumble. She stepped forward with confidence, not because she had become someone different, but because she had finally learned that kindness was never weakness and humility was never something to hide. Sometimes the smallest act of grace could change an entire kingdom, and sometimes one unexpected step could open the door to the life that had been waiting all along. If Emily's journey reminded you that true worth is found in kindness, courage, and character rather than status, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, share this story with someone who needs a little hope today, and tell us in the comments. If you had been in Emily's place, would you have stayed in the palace or walked away?